Hey, it's Stuart, and I've been trying to think of a way to neatly wrap up our first season, and for a long time, nothing really came to mind. But during this past year, as I've been talking to people about the project, the one question I keep getting asked is why outer space?
I mean, like you said, space is cool, space is off kilter. It's funny that you reached out at the time that you did because
That
I
was
was
from the most
just
recent
reading that
episode with Eric from the indie rock band Say Hi.
Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Have you read that or heard about that?
I have heard about it. That was she did not appear on the show. I did reach out to her publicist, and I can't remember if I heard back from them or not. But it was on our radar. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of the coolest representation of space that I've read about or listened to or seen or I mean, well, I don't know. I'm sure I've seen some cool space movies that probably resonated with me just as much. But anyway, it's great and it represents space from some astronauts' perspective and um it reminded me of a headspace that I get to sometimes when I'm making music where I'm focusing on the minutia of being alive on earth or being in one's own head, and then you think about the vastness of space and all of that stuff seems really really insignificant or small, and that's I think one of the things that I was trying to do with that song that you we've been talking about is the constellations, the astrology of based on constellations, thinking about space, staring at space. I've never stared at the Earth from space like they do in that book, and I don't think I ever will because I get motion sickness very easily, and B, I don't see myself ever being able to afford one of those trips to space. But the grandness of it is exciting to me, and I need just even in everyday life, I need to remind myself sometimes to look up and stare into the sky and not be so concerned with what's going on in my head and what's going on down here on Earth because it's big and it's vast and it's majestic up there.
I didn't ask every guest for this season why they chose to do something about outer space, though in retrospect, I probably should have. But we did touch on the topic a few times. Annie Saunders, who made the book Apollo Remastered, had this to say about outer space as a subject. In particular, why preserving photos from the Apollo missions matter. Big picture stuff like why does it matter to the average person, to someone who's maybe never thought about reading a book like Apollo Remastered before? Why is it important that we all get to see outer space?
I might be biased, but I think a lot of people would agree that walking on the moon is probably our greatest ever achievement. The photographs that were taken of this pivotal moment when we humans were able to leave our home planet for the first time and walk on another world, and the photographs will forever symbolise and document the beginning of humanity's expansion out into the universe. We'll eventually, yes, we walked on the moon, we'll eventually walk on Mars, we will eventually become a multiplanetary species, but this is where it all began. It was Richard Underwood, who's NASA's chief of photography, who made the point to the astronauts before they went that, look, when you get back, you'll be a national hero, and maybe in decades there may be some really nerdy teenager that wants to go through all the data and all of the documentation, but really it's the photographs are kind of the starting point forever of referring back to going to the moon. So if you get great photographs, they'll live forever. And I think he was right. Earthrise, the Blue Marble, Buzz Aldrin, Man on the Moon. It's the photographs that I think we naturally turn to, and they will forever, I think, document and symbolise what is a pivotal moment in human evolution. Like I say, photographs for 50 years were based on this duplicate film, and just the way they presented just drove me nuts, because they were also getting progressively worse. So you had all this copying of duplicate film back in the analog days, and then in the digital world, it got worse because it's so easy to put a JPEG on the internet. Someone will copy it and save it again and put it back on and crop it and rotate. And it just hit me that to me, the most important photographs I've ever taken are actually getting progressively worse as time goes on, whilst being seen by a progressively bigger audience. And that concept I could not accept that. And so to finally have the holy grail of film, this original film, out of the freezer. So this is the film that was actually in the cameras on the moon. So we can think of negative film. It wasn't actually negative film. It was the colour photographs. The image resided on that very film that was in the camera in a colour correct positive form. So to have that film that was literally exposed in this alien environment finally out of this freezer and scanned to an incredibly high resolution, to go back to the source for the first time and be able to see these photographs in a way you've never been able to see before, that is what compelled me to, when I see a bad image, it's tantamount to someone writing about Apollo 11 and misquoting Armstrong's One Small Step speech. I mean, it just shouldn't happen. They are too important not to be seen correctly and at the best, which is why then I decided to, once this film came out the freezer, I put my life on hold, and 10,000 hours of digital processing later and a lot of research, we finally able to see the Apollo missions in this way.
If there's one photo in Apollo Remastered, one we haven't discussed yet, is there one that you'd recommend?
Gosh, that's an almost impossible question. Like I said, this took 35,000, narrowing it down to 400 for the book, which is unusual. I mean, it's a huge number for a book, 400 photographs, and it was almost impossible. So to then narrow that down to one, and I like different photographs for different reasons. There are these historically important ones, such as the only clear image of Neil Armstrong on the moon. But probably if I was really, really pressed, I mean, the front cover, and it's probably obvious to say, it made the front cover, it had a bit of everything. So this was a photograph that was unbelievably underexposed. So when I was going through these 35,000 photographs, I'm looking for anything that gives me a clue that there might be something interesting in it that's worth the 1.3 gigabyte file download and spending time to look into it. But there was a little glint of a window. So I thought, well, there might be something. If I can see a window, there might be a person in it. And I could see a little purple square in the corner of the window, which I knew was the guidance site. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at that. And then when I started to stretch the contrast and look at what was in this, I thought, oh, wow, there's a person in this, and this could be a fantastic photograph. But again, it is so underexposed. When you push the processing this hard, I had all these artifacts on it. It just was not presentable. But it was clearly going to be a stunning image. So that front cover took me about 2 days working on it to get it right. And we end up, it's a portrait of the commander, Jim McDivitt, on Apollo 9. It looks like he's looking up in wonder through the window, but in fact, the reality is even better. So in researching all his photographs, I spoke to Rusty Schweikart, who actually took that photograph. And he said, I can't tell you how hard Jim is focusing in this moment. Because as it turns out, he is actually undertaking the docking, not any old docking, the first ever docking between two crewed spacecraft. So an incredibly high pressure moment. This was the first time we had people in a spacecraft that was incapable of getting them home because they were in the lunar module that has no heat shield and they were in Earth orbit. So Apollo 9 didn't go to the moon. They were just testing the lunar module and the command module. So the heat shield was on the command module that he was trying to dock to. So if he didn't make the docking, and it's never been done before, they are not getting home. He also had to translate all the movement through 90 degrees in his head because the controls were set up to land on the moon to look forwards out of the lunar module window, but he was looking up, performing the docking. So Rusty Schweikart said he tried to get the inverted commas software adapted to do this for him before the flight, but NASA said, we've not got time for that. Don't worry, Jim will be fine. So Jim had to translate all these movements through 90 degrees in his head. He had to dock, if not, they weren't getting home, and it's never been done before, and this is the moment it's happening. So this photograph for me had a bit of everything. It's one we've almost never seen because it was in such a bad state. The lighting is stunning, and we have this portrait of the commander undertaking this first docking. So that photograph, for me, is probably one that's got a little bit of everything in it.
Speaking of nerdy teenagers, Jackson Tyler was a nerdy teenager who turned his obsession with NASA film into a full-blown documentary. Jackson sources all of his footage from the public domain and turned it into a series called Homemade Documentaries.
NASA footage, anything shot in orbit in space, anything shot by NASA, is very well cataloged and in the public domain. Ideally, it is free and accessible to all Americans and, by extension, kind of the world. But that's not really what the reality is. And the trick is that the film is public domain, but the digital scans aren't necessarily. And so what happens is you have all these film reels that have been shot in space and all this amazing footage, but they're locked away in these filing cabinets at the National Archives. And then private individuals and companies like Periscope, for example, these historical companies will invest thousands of dollars to scan these films, but then they'll hold on to that footage as a means of making money from it because they want to get back what they invested to scan it. And so even though the footage is public domain, there's kind of a gotcha because there's a lot of it that's not easily accessible and a lot of it that's held by a network of companies and individuals who are looking to basically sell it to the industry.
So how are you getting your hands on it?
A little bit of both. So I'm both working with those individuals and companies when I can get a reasonable deal. And also, particularly with this latest project, which had a lot of footage that had never been scanned because there really wasn't the interest or the motivation to scan it because there's not a whole lot of focus on the early shuttle program. Most of the focus is on the moon program. And so I had to actually go to a company and pay them to go into the National Archives and scan all this footage for the very first time. And it was amazing, but it was also very expensive. It was thousands of dollars.
So you're physically going to the National Archives? Is that...
The company is. I am paying them, and they are sending people in, licensed. They're a licensed vendor of the National Archives, and basically NARA turns the film reels over to them, and they use their powerful machines to scan it. They put it on a hard drive, and they mail it to me. But they are under no obligation to make those scans public, and I'm the only one who actually sees them in the end.
Wow. So how much raw footage do you think you have, like, in your possession right now, like, from the time you began doing this until this very moment? How much footage would you say you're sitting on?
Very little in the context of the entire space program. I have pretty much every onboard piece of film spanning 1961 through 1972, and that includes all of our trips to the moon. But when you consider that shuttle ran from the 70s to 2011, I would say I probably have about 25 to 30% of the onboard film that was shot on orbit, that the film that was actually carried into space. I'd say a full 70% of it I still don't have. And most of that is going to be Skylab and shuttle. And then that's not even including launch angles. So hundreds of cameras were rolling for each of these launches. And there's just angles after angles after angles, and those all sort of get scattered to the wind. They're not all at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Some of them are actually kept at Johnson Space Center. I recently learned that there's 70 millimeter IMAX footage kept in a salt mine outside the Kansas Cosmosphere. Now, that's public domain footage, but it's so hard to access, and it's locked behind all these hurdles and steps and very expensive to scan. So it's a challenge because it's a little bit like being an archaeologist. You're trying to dig this stuff up and follow this paper trail, hopefully to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that contains something that's really exciting and worth watching.
All right, so help me wrap my mind around this a little bit, because does it by default become public domain because in theory the space program belongs to all of us?
Exactly. It's exactly it. It is all by default from the moment it is shot and developed. It belongs to the U.S. taxpayer. It belongs to the public. NASA holds no copyright on any of the footage. The IMAX film, there may be a nuance there, but I was talking with the IMAX cinematographer who actually trained the astronauts to use those big cameras in space. And I think he mentioned that they had some kind of special, very short-term copyright that expired 5-10 years after it was shot, and we're well past that now. So yeah, there's no copyright whatsoever. The footage is all purely public domain.
Another concept I touched on a lot during the first season is that stories taking place in other worlds can still feel close to home. Take Jim Cogan, the creator of the fictional podcast Strange New Worlds and Spaced Out Tales. Even though his stories take place outside of our own worlds, the characters are still pretty down to earth.
Sci-fi has always been massive. I grew up early 80s, so Star Wars was everywhere. Obviously, I'm aware of Star Trek. Not as much of a fan, but I was a huge Star Wars person. I did used to read a lot of sci-fi. Reading kind of took a bit of a backseat as my time got fewer and fewer. So it's probably more sci-fi movies have been my big thing. I quite like the kind of grimy, dirty, sort of blue-collar type sci-fi, the stuff you'd get from Alien and Aliens, and even the lots of older sci-fi stuff like Silent Runnings or 2001. These are probably much more where my interests lie, where the people aren't perfect, they aren't square-jawed heroes. But it's an extraordinary setting out in space, but recognizable people that, doing jobs that you recognize, things that aren't that glamorous, but are more kind of grounded in something like reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one element that I think most good sci-fi seems to have, where maybe the world you're in, you don't recognize so much, but you can connect with some of the characters, some of the problems they face are very recognizable. And in that way, it's still maybe not quite as disorienting as sci-fi could be.
I think it depends. I think there is something to be said for kind of like Star Trek's sort of very comfortable, warm, utopian sort of view of the future, where everybody comes together and we've all sorted out all of the world's problems and now we're sorting out the universe's problems. That's all very nice and it has its place, and I think some people absolutely obviously love that. It's got it kind of reminds you as to, it is possible potentially for humanity to come together and do the right thing. But human nature as such is they tend to do the wrong thing, or we tend to do what we're doing now just in a futuristic setting. And I don't know if it's the natural pragmatist in me or whatever. I just find that so much more relatable if it's grounded like that, yeah.
When Timi O wrote her debut novel, Do You Dream of Terra 2?, she had a similar idea in mind. Her story, while very much a sci-fi, is still rooted in reality.
I had the idea just before I turned 19, because it was the year I took off before I went to university. I was working at a bookstore, and the manager of the bookstore said, "What are you going to do tomorrow? Today's the last day you're ever going to be 18." I remember just thinking, it's the last day I'm ever going to be 18? And just thinking like I was on the cusp of adulthood and leaving all my siblings behind and going to university. And I had this like real feeling of loss all of a sudden, even though I'd spent the whole year just so excited to leave everyone behind. So I was thinking about like that feeling, and I'd read a couple of space books. And my main question at the time had been like, how does it feel to leave everything behind? Like, do they miss Earth? Do they miss their family? It's a real commitment to go on a long journey. So yeah, my idea for Terra 2 kind of came from a mixture of those inspirations. I have these characters who are 18, 19, and they've been picked for this mission, which will take 23 years to colonize an Earth-like planet. They'll be the first. No one's ever set foot there before. And it starts on their last day on Earth where they're thinking, what am I going to miss? And a tragedy happens on their last day on Earth. And then the book sort of follows that and their journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that jumped out to me that became very clear, I think, pretty early on into the book, and I imagine other readers had a similar experience, was that as far as science fiction goes, this was a pretty grounded story. I mean, it's the world we live in. I guess with the one thing being different is that space exploration is a good full century, if not more, ahead of where we're actually at. But other than that slightly altered timeline, this is very, very grounded. Which I'm curious about that decision, because I mean sometimes science fiction can be very disorienting.
Yeah, I think because I'd read like a lot of space novels and I felt like that was what I was missing. I mean, since then there have been a lot more that have come out that have probably addressed this, but at the time I remember just thinking, how does it feel? I just felt like there was this emotional side and something about space that makes you think about death, since it's obviously like such an inhospitable place, and loneliness and solitude, but then also this human frontier. I don't know, it just seemed like a really emotionally rich setting, and I felt like the only way to help the reader to connect with exactly how it would feel and really be able to put themselves in that scenario is to change almost nothing except for that they're in space, if that makes sense. So I have all of the same real world references, and is London and the Olympics happen. History is the same, except that, yeah, space exploration is about 100 years more advanced.
Other stories take us completely out of our element. When Sloan Leong made the graphic novel Prism Stalker, she created her own world, complete with new species and planets. Even still, it was a way of confronting difficult topics that challenge us as a society.
Besides Vep, who's kind of our lead, we have Tura, who is a student she meets at the academy. Vep joins this basically military academy where they become scouts. And this is kind of like the fantastical element, is they are learning a martial arts that is based on this planet's ability to animate matter, but also to kind of erode the borders between people's psyches. So there's a lot of psychic martial arts happening, along with just crazy physical feats that they can now do in this world that allows them to do that. So that's very inspired by like a lot of shonen manga, classic action comics. But yeah, we have Tura, who comes from a small moon monastery. She's more religious. She's a bit mysterious. We don't get a lot of her backstory, but she becomes close to Vep very quickly. And then our other kind of co-lead is Sabrian, who comes from a planet of these kind of like feline people, more of a warrior type culture. And she's here to kind of become a scout, become a member of this elite, kind of like gain elite status amongst the academy and kind of do her people proud. And for the people that are able to graduate this academy, they are able to be allotted a piece of land so they can also, move other people of their culture there. For the people that do fail out of this academy, they are stuck there because to be able to live on this planet, you have to incorporate an element. Usually, in this case, it's like a little gemstone, and that kind of like grounds them to this planet. But otherwise, you are not able to safely leave it because you could spread its like hylozoic element to other planets. So if you fail out of the academy, you're stuck on this planet, and you basically are going to become like a laborer, which is a real bummer. We have the chorus, which is like the governance system here. It's like a group of omniscient beings. We don't really see them. We only hear about them adjacently from other authority figure characters in the story. But they kind of purport to be very like, what they see as a utopic kind of society that they have created, but it comes with a lot of checks and balances, because when you introduce, I feel like in science fiction, there's a lot of utopias are very focused on like monospecies. It's like human dominant, human needs are getting taken care of. And I wanted to explore a world where it was like, okay, if you have a whole like universe of multiple species, how are we balancing their needs? Because some are going to be meat eaters, some are going to feed on plants. And what if you have sentient plant aliens? And what if you have, basically species with conflicting needs? How do you balance that? So for this world, they have, it gets lightly into this, but you can kind of tell by the variety of aliens that you actually see in the comic that there is clearly a lot going on to sustain these different types of aliens. There's quadrupeds, there's like millipede-like aliens of all sizes. So the world, the architecture, it's got to adapt to people with different like locomotions. So that's kind of the world we're playing in here and the types of characters we're exploring.
Timo had a somewhat similar approach to directing the satire Star Wreck.
It seems like satire is weirdly a pretty effective tool for that. I mean, I think like I'm a documentary guy myself, so I'm more biased towards documentaries, but I think there's no argument that stuff like South Park and other satires and comedy tends to be a pretty effective vehicle to kind of tell these stories about like where we're headed.
What it does is it always like it places the viewer, it sort of takes the viewer out of their own sort of box or their own sort of vantage point, and it places them into a different vantage point because it is allowing humor and comedy and satirical content there. So it is clear that this is not exactly as the world is, but actually it allows you a different perspective into the world that we are living in, and thus allows you to inspect that from a different place, and gives you some tools that are, because, you can't walk around in your own world and sort of your own relationships or your own country and government stuff and all that, and look at it as, oh, this is such a hilarious satirical thing, because it's happening to you and it's happening constantly. It's all around there. But if you're watching a story that is completely satirical and ridiculous, but it's still talking about the same topics, it allows you to really view those things a little bit deeper, a little bit from a different perspective, and allows you to form in your head the thought processes that are sometimes hard to reach in your everyday world when you're walking around and just inspecting and watching the world go by. It's very hard to look at it as a satire. But when somebody does a satire about that, you're able to see something a little bit different. So I find it very strong tool, but you have to know how to use it very well, because, and that was one of the things, for example, with Iron Sky, because we have a very harsh topic like Nazism, Nazis. They are not a joke by definition. I mean, these are heinous, horrible war crimes that took place, crimes against humanity that took place and killed millions and millions of innocent people because of that. So making that into a satirical tool, you have to be careful. You have to understand the tool quite precisely before you really go into using it, because otherwise you can create a counter effective, it can turn against yourself, and then you find yourself in a big trouble if you don't know what it is that you're using it. So there is that challenge with satire, so you have to know what you're doing.
So that's it. That's our wrap for season 1. If you've enjoyed these clips and haven't been able to yet, be sure to check out full episodes at crewcollectivepodcast.com or anywhere else you get podcasts. And if you've listened to all of them and have been enjoying it, feel free to listen again and then share it with a friend or family member. They might like it too. Finally, stay tuned to this feed, because we will have an update about the future of the show in the coming weeks.